Well, 1 week into his term, the new U.S. president has managed to widen some eyes with his controversial decisions and often questionable comments. Already, EU officials are cautious, Chinese leaders anxious, Mexican officials disgruntled, and Muslims and minorities in the U.S. are worried as a result of only the first week of Trump's administration coming together, a ship which is seemingly moving in the direction of many of his shocking pledges made during the presidential campaign. Now, with the controversial cabinet picks assuming their posts and international trade deals on the verge of being terminated, many are left wondering what to expect from the Trump presidency. Now, joining us on hand for this edition of Press TV's debate, we've got our correspondent Roshan Mohammad Saleh, who's joining us from the British capital, London. Roshan, welcome to Press TV's debate. A questionable and contentious first week for the Trump administration, to say the least. What challenges does the new U.S. administration pose for Europe?
Well, we've just been listening, haven't we, to the first foreign leader to visit Trump, Theresa May. And from Britain's perspective, you know, she's gone there with cap in hand because Britain is leaving the European Union. So previously, the two most important bilateral relationships for Britain were the one with the European Union and then the other with America. They're leaving the European Union now, so that makes them more dependent on America. So in that press conference, we heard lots about the special relationship, and obviously Theresa May has gone there for a trade deal. And she wants that trade deal when Britain leaves the European Union. But I think the press conference illustrated the imbalance of power. You had the American president there, and his intentions are very unclear as to, you know, regards Europe, especially when it comes to Russia and NATO. You know, he spoke in platitudes. He didn't give much details. He spoke very briefly, whereas Theresa May spoke in depth, gave details about what they talked about, the trade deal, Russia, NATO, fighting ISIL, etc. And that, I think, proves that the special relationship is far more important to the British than it is to the Americans. As far as Europe is concerned, the two main questions, I think, is Trump's relationship with Russia. He's vowed to diffuse tensions. Obviously, we have many European capitals, Paris, London, Germany, that seem to thrive on increasing tensions with Russia. And they want America to stand by NATO, the European-American alliance. And Donald Trump has called NATO obsolete. At this stage, it's unclear what Trump is going to do. He himself doesn't seem to know what he's going to do. He has to establish relationships with European leaders, Putin, Merkel, you know, Hollande in France, and Theresa May in Britain. Yeah, there's a lot to play for. The stakes are very high, but the stakes are definitely higher for Europe than they are for America.
All right, thank you very much, Roshan. Press TV's Roshan Mohammad Saleh joining us from London. Tonight's a focus in this edition of Press TV's debate is Donald Trump's foreign policy. To further expand on that notion, we're joined by Mr. Brian Becker from the Answer Coalition, who's joining us from Washington. And also joining us from Boston is Mr. Jim Walsh from the Security Studies Program. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with our guest in Washington, Mr. Becker. Sir, give us your perspective on some of the key points that came up in the press conference that we just saw between the British Prime Minister and the new U.S. President Donald Trump.
Well, I think the most important thing about the press conference, and even more so about the visit itself, is that Theresa May needs this relationship, this special relationship with the United States, now under the leadership of Donald Trump, much more than Donald Trump needs Theresa May or the UK. So there is a power imbalance between the two. Britain has been consumed by Brexit and what it will mean. Will it be a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit? It looks very much like Theresa May means a hard Brexit, meaning that Britain will not be allowed into the common market, into the unified market, because it will insist on depriving other EU citizens from other EU countries from having the rights to live and work in the UK. It's going to be one or the other. It can't be both. As a consequence, Britain needs to be able to say this won't be a complete economic catastrophe for British capital. The only way that they can really show that is to cement a closer relationship with Trump in the United States. That gives Trump a lot of cards to play. and Trump will play the cards. He will want to establish economic trade deals with Theresa May that are much more favorable to U.S. business and to U.S. banks, to the detriment, actually, of the British. So I think the British come here, hat in hand, in a weaker position as a consequence of the unanticipated referendum vote that separated the British from the EU. And now they're about to trigger Article 50. And I think triggering Article 50 will show that there will be a hard Brexit. Also, the Scottish nation will now, I think, have a second referendum. Nicola Sturgeon, the leader in Scotland of the Scottish National Party, has said as much, because Scotland does not want to leave the EU and does not want to have a hard Brexit. So not only is Britain leaving the EU, but Scotland may be leaving the UK. That leaves the UK and Theresa May in a much weaker position.
Let's cross over to our guest in Boston. Mr. Walsh, give us your analysis of the key points that were brought up in the joint press conference. Of course, the issue of NATO was brought up. The quote-unquote special relationship between the United States and the UK was touched upon, and also the issue of enhancing trade relations, not just with the UK, but also with the whole of Europe, was also an issue that was focused upon in the press conference as well.
Well, I think if you looked at the Prime Minister's remarks prior to Mr. Trump taking office, she was already busy trying to nuzzle up to the president-elect, criticizing the Obama administration, supporting Mr. Trump in some of the more outrageous things he had been saying before he took office. And so I think she's bet heavily here. She's all in on Donald Trump. And I think for the reasons that your other guests and correspondent have suggested. But I think it's a dangerous bet on her part. Not only does she come from a somewhat weaker position, both politically and in terms of sort of geopolitical strength more generally, she's in a bit of a bind here. You know, I'm sure many in Britain wonder if this is going to be Tony Blair to George W. Bush all over again, whether she will end up his puppet or puppy or whatever the phrase was. And that's a dangerous position to be in. What makes it even more dangerous for her, I think.
Mr. Becker, the issue with Mexico turned a notch more serious when the Mexican president canceled his U.S. trip. We've also heard Trump embracing that proposal of increasing a tax on imported goods to finance the construction of the infamous border wall. Do you think that Trump is treading in a path which will potentially lead to damaging ties with Mexico?
Yes, I definitely do. I think that what Trump did this last week is amazing when you think about it. The Enrique Peña Nieto, the president of Mexico, sent his foreign minister, who calls himself a personal friend of Donald Trump and a personal friend of Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law and senior White House advisor. And on the day that they had the foreign minister in Washington to cement a new day in U.S.-Mexican relations, Donald Trump issued an executive order announcing that they were going to go ahead and build this huge wall at the U.S.-Mexican border, an impassable wall, and that he also insisted that Mexico would pay for that wall, which, of course, the United States would construct against Mexico's wishes, but Mexico would somehow be compelled to pay for it. Now, Mexico is a country that's 120 million people. It's the 11th largest country in the world. It's not a small country. It's bigger than Germany. It's bigger than France. It's bigger than the United Kingdom. Every day, $1.5 billion in trade crosses the U.S.-Mexican border. The U.S. and Mexico's second largest trade partner is the United States. $580 billion in trade every year. And at that moment, when the foreign minister, trying to be nice to Trump, comes to Washington, they provocatively announce this. And thus, Enrique Peña Nieto, the president, was compelled because of public pressure from the right, from all of Mexican society, to cancel the meeting next Tuesday scheduled in Washington with Trump. That's dangerous, stupid, reckless, feckless arrogance on the part of the Trump administration against a country that, again, a principal ally and partner and economic trading partner with the United States. Amazing bad politics on the part of the Trump White House.
And Mr. Walsh, your thoughts on the question with Mexico? Many believe that Donald Trump has already managed to sour the relationship with one of the key allies of the United States in just a week of being in office.
Yeah, there's no doubt that this was poorly handled. You don't issue public ultimatums and expect a sovereign nation to just sort of give in to them. I think that was really poorly played. But I will say this, it's the first week. There are, 51 more weeks left in this year, 3 more years after that. This is an administration that doesn't even have its Secretary of State in office, doesn't have its national security team, lots of holes to fill, and it's an administration that seems to be shooting from the hip. Now, after some of these problems blow up on them, after they have a chance to settle and have a cabinet that's actually in place that can offer advice about some of these policies, things might begin to settle down. Again, we're in the first week here. I think we've seen several examples of things being badly played, but there is still plenty of time to recover. And I would encourage Mr. Trump to spend less time criticizing American allies while he's complimenting American adversaries like Russia. First order of business, it seems to me, is to have strong friendly relations with the countries that are on your border, Canada and Mexico. That has a lot to do with your prosperity and your security. So hopefully others will be able to get his attention and things will settle down in the weeks to come. But we just don't know. I mean, my God, who would have expected this? Who knows what the future will bring?
Mr. Becker, talking about the future, everyone is still anticipating to see what Trump has in mind with regards to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, which Iran signed with the P5+1. Just recently, the outgoing German foreign minister, among other officials and diplomats, recommended that the Iran deal should remain intact. Do you think that these are calls that the U.S. president will heed with the constant pressure of the Republican-dominated Congress?
Well, there were indications at the confirmation hearings, both for the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, and Mike Pompeo, the new CIA director, who was virulently against Iran and against the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action when he was in the U.S. Congress, that the U.S. must uphold its international legal obligations. That would indicate that at least there are significant forces within the administration who believe that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action must be adhered to formally and legally, as of course it must be by the United States. It's a legal obligation. And also they realize that should the United States be the one to back out of the treaty, all that will happen is that the so-called allies in Europe and other countries that were part of the P5+1 will say the United States was the one that walked away from the treaty, not Iran. Thus, their own position and orientation towards Iran and the lifting of sanctions, I think, will stay in place. So it will become the United States that's isolated. But let's not forget this. Donald Trump is a strong leader, an unpredictable leader, possibly not a sane leader. When you look at what he's done in the last week and what he's done through the whole campaign, there's an element of sort of megalomaniacal insanity in his presentation. You look at, for instance, he's still focused on the election. Even though he won the election, his big deal now is that there was 3 to 5 million illegal votes cast, which there's no evidence or proof of, which would have allowed him to win the popular vote too. Now, what president wins the election and then charges that the election is illegitimate because of illegal voting? I mean, why focus on that? It's something about his personality. It's about that person. And now he is the person. He is the president of the United States. In fact, just to remind our whole audience, in the United States, the president of the United States has sole unilateral control over the nuclear codes and the nuclear decision-making. In other words, within 10 minutes of any threat or perceived threat or accident, Donald Trump has 1,400 nuclear weapons under his control and authority. We just don't know what's coming. I don't want to be alarmist, but that's the reality. He has unilateral control. This guy, Donald Trump, has that kind of power.
Mr. Walsh, I see you laughing there at some of the analogies made there. Would you like to add anything to the comments made by Mr. Becker?
Well, I do think that I agree with the analysis that says the Iran agreement, the JCPOA, is not likely to be a high priority for the Trump administration. And the testimony and other statements by others suggest that he's not looking to rip up the deal on the first day like some of that campaign rhetoric would have suggested. So I take solace in that. And my own personal view is they're going to have so many fires, so many controversies and problems, you know, from one day to the next, from week to week, that this is not going to rise to a level where it's a real priority for them. So I do expect that all the parties will continue to abide by the agreement as they have so far. I would say probably I have these two concerns. One is that there will be elements in Congress, Republicans in Congress, that will continue to try to pass legislation to undermine the deal. So that requires keeping an eye on. And then secondly, it's a variation of what we were talking about before. Mr. Trump has described himself as a counterpuncher. And so as long as this is on the back burner, I don't think he's really going to care very much. But if there were to be some sort of event or crisis that brought Iran and the U.S. To focus on each other, in a negative way, then all bets are off. Then he might, rashly try to strike back because of some other issue and use the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action as the way to cause new trouble. I'm not predicting that. I'm just saying that that's one of the scenarios. But I think all things considered, this is not where Mr. Trump's priorities are, and hopefully we'll let sleeping dogs lie and never have to really deal with this.
Mr. Becker, let's turn our focus back to what's in store for Europe. We know that EU finance ministers are already seeing Trump as a risk to their monetary union, and Ted Malloch's comments already seem being seen as playing the wrong strings about the EU's currency. Where do you think the new U.S. administration plans on steering its ties and trade ties, most notably with European countries, given how intertwined EU and NATO are, and how any possible changes in U.S.-NATO interactions could affect the EU and vice versa?
Well, there too, I don't really anticipate a major change in the U.S. orientation towards NATO. I mean, Trump is saying, the different member nations need to pay their fair share, et cetera, et cetera. He says it's obsolete, which, obviously the Warsaw Pact disappeared 25 years ago. So NATO has been constantly searching for some self-justification for its continued existence. That part is true. And the difference with Trump is he says he wants better relations with Russia, which of course would be welcome given how dangerous the relations with Russia have become under the last stage of the Obama administration, and as was evidenced by Hillary Clinton's awful orientation towards Russia. But I don't think there will be a big change towards NATO per se. I think, though, the German foreign minister who said last week the post-World War order is over, I believe we don't know for sure whether that's true or whether that's hyperbolic, but it feels like it's coming to an end. And by the post-World War II order, we mean where the United States took all of the major non-socialist, advanced capitalist countries and put them together as a network under the U.S. control. So there was NATO and the U.S.-Japanese relationship. In other words, even the enemies in World War II became friends and junior partners under the United States, and the United States had a multilateral orientation. The UN, the World Bank, the IMF, these were post-World War II institutions led by the United States, but trying to manage rivalries that had led to wars in World War I and World War II. I feel that order is coming apart, sort of in an unpredictable way, by Trump's America First orientation and his sort of roughness and bullying rather than treating allies as allies. And you can see the new U.S. ambassador to the UN said, Anybody who doesn't have our back here, meaning the U.S. allies in Europe, we're taking names. We're taking names. I mean, this is kind of bullying language that can't really allow the old world order to stay in place much longer, I don't think.
And let's get in a final comment from Mr. Walsh in Boston. Mr. Walsh, your thoughts on the future ties and composition that we might see with regards to the United States, Europe, NATO, Russia, mashing them all up together. What do you see?
Well, I agree that I don't think the U.S. is going to walk away from NATO. You know, again, I want to underline, we're in the first week here, the first week. And so it's easy to talk a big game, but there are some real realities out there that constrain what a president will do. You know, there are national interests. The U.S. has national interests it has to protect. Europe has its own national interests. I personally don't necessarily see a decline of the post-war project. I would not welcome that. That would scare me. It seems to me that this Western Europe, what we've been able to achieve is a long peace, no World War I's, no World War II's, and general economic prosperity in Europe and the United States. That's a pretty good victory to have achieved. I hope they don't put it at threat. What worries me, perhaps, is the possibility that Mr. Trump might directly or indirectly support nationalist parties in Europe, you know, not simply criticize Europe, which he's doing now, which I think is completely unhelpful, but if he actually starts to get involved in their domestic politics, that could be a very dangerous situation. So I hope he doesn't go that way. I hope his advisors prevail, hopefully some sane advisors, and also just realities. At some point, regardless of the ideas in your head, reality imposes itself, and I hope reality will teach Mr. Trump the limits of American power here and the importance of peace and stability.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh, and that marks the end of this edition of Press TV's debate. I'd like to thank my guests, Mr. Brian Becker from the Answer Coalition, joining us from Washington, and also from Boston, Mr. Jim Walsh from the Security Studies program at MIT. I'd like to thank you fine gentlemen for your comments and for contributing to this segment of the program. And that's a wrap for this edition of Press TV's debate. Thanks for watching, everybody. Do stay tuned. We'll be back on the bottom of the hour with a look at the world news. Bye for now.